everybody. Hope everybody's having a good day so far. Today we're going to be discussing a little bit about, or we have a guest speaker here to discuss a little bit about the benefits of genetically modified crops. As you might remember, he's given a few talks like this in the past, and with the recent flare-up of change in policies from restaurants in the country, it seems to be more appropriate now more than ever. Excuse me. A little bit of background on our guest speaker today. He's a horticulture major, so he knows a little bit about his stuff now. He's worked in a GM switchgrass lab in Latham, actually, here on campus as a lab assistant. A little bit of personal background info for him. He's been experienced with crops most of his life. He comes from Virginia Beach, where his dad worked in a pretty big garden, so he had a little bit of experience with that as well. He seems really passionate about what he's talking about, so here today we have Tim Bryant to talk to us about genetically modified crops.
Hey, how are you guys doing today? I just want to thank Kalynn for the awesome introduction, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm going to be talking about the benefits of genetically modified crops, but the more important part is I'll go a little bit into the risks of those and some fundamental questions that a lot of people have about how we should integrate these into our society today. So just a little starting question, how many of you guys would say you're pretty familiar with what genetically modified crops are? Okay, most of you, as I figured. How many would you say have like a strong opinion either way, for or against? Okay, about half of you. So I'm not trying to disagree with any of your opinions. I'm just going to say a little bit about the benefits of genetically modified crops to feed the growing world. So why you should care about this, 10% of the land we have in the United States for agriculture is already using genetically modified crops. So it's in the food that you eat today, and it affects you pretty highly on a daily basis. And if none of that world hunger stuff interests you, 9 out of 10 top 10 American beers all use GM corn syrup in them. So, everyone can get behind beer college. So just a little bit of the benefits of GM crops. First off, we're going to have fewer pesticide use. A lot of these crops, for example, corn, BT corn specifically, takes a gene from a different plant and inserts it into the corn to create a protein that's only toxic to the larvae of insects that attack corn. So basically they're going to be using less pesticides and less pesticides to take care of these pest control problems, and that's going to have less runoff into the water system and less environmental impact. Along the same lines, less herbicide use. They have crops that are already resistant to herbicides, which allows them to use post-emergence practices. So usually they're going to be spraying herbicides around the crops to keep the weeds from coming up at all. But when they use these herbicide-resistant forms, they can basically just wait until the weeds come up and then pull them out. This is also going to reduce environmental impacts because they can use low tillage practices, which is reducing the amount of nutrients that are taken out of the soil every year, making it more sustainable for the future. There's also a really cool concept called biofortification, which is something they're working on a lot nowadays. One example of this is golden rice. A lot of developing countries eat a lot of rice to sustain themselves. Basically, that's their entire diet. And a lot of times they become vitamin A deficient because eating one staple crop like that isn't always going to provide all the nutrients you need. So golden rice is something where they're trying to fortify the vitamin A in the rice, which is going to make less vitamin A deficiencies in a lot of these developing countries and reduce things like blindness and vitamin deficiency. So a few of the risks that people believe are out there with genetically modified crops are resistant insects and pests. So insects evolve just like plants do. So if we're using genetically modified crops that are resistant to insects, the insects can also evolve to become resistant to the resistance that's already there. One way that farmers can avoid this, though, is to use practices to evolve with the insects. They're using new varieties of crops every single year with different properties. So some fundamental questions that a lot of people have about genetically modified crops. This is a lot of things that go around the media and the mainstream understanding of what genetically modified crops are. So people wonder, is genetically engineering crops a fundamentally new practice? And the answer to this is no. We've been doing this for hundreds of years just by crossing inbred lines of plants. For example, corn comes from maize and teosinte, which are other cereal grains. So they just cross the inbred lines that they've been making for hundreds of years to get more desirable traits. And GM crops, actually inserting DNA into different plants, is just a more efficient and effective way to do this today. Some people believe that it crosses genetic barriers because you're inserting DNA into a place where it doesn't belong, but every plant has DNA in it already, and it's not necessarily foreign material, it's just not DNA that was already coded in that plant. So that kind of ties into another main question people have, which is, are genetically modified crops safe for human consumption? So there's no difference in the DNA that they insert into these new plants. It's just not DNA that was originally there. So it basically just adds new material for the plant to code protein that creates a desired function. So another thing that ties into the safety is that all these companies that are producing genetically modified seed are being tested by the USDA for safety before they're allowed to distribute their seed, which obviously they're not going to allow anything into the general public that's not going to be safe for human consumption. And there hasn't been a single death or injury reported related to genetically modified crops. There's been a small amount of studies done on the effects. There was one specifically in Norway on rats. They fed them genetically modified potatoes and were reported to have organ failure, but there's been a lot of criticisms on the methods they used in that study, and there's just not a lot of information out there right now. Research is done every day, and that's going to continue to further people's understanding of if we should use these crops or not. So moving into the environmental impacts, a lot of people don't understand how it's going to affect the environment. There's negative effects and positive effects, but I think the positive effects will outweigh that in the long run. Agriculture does more damage to the environment than any other industry currently today. Pesticide and herbicide use mainly runs off into the water system, creates algae blooms. You lose a lot of biodiversity in water systems, as well as pests that are affected by pesticide and herbicide use that aren't the targets. So again, going with that, low tillage practices can be used to maintain nutrients in the soil and water content, and then low pesticide use is also very important because you're going to have less of that running into the water system. So then another important question is, who's actually benefiting from GM crops? A lot of people believe that it's just the seed companies that are allowed to have intellectual property over the seed they're producing, which isn't necessarily a good thing for farmers, but in the long run it's going to lower their production costs and allow them to produce more food, higher yields, more money for farmers. Also, the less farmers are putting into it, the more consumers are going to get out of it. So they're producing more corn for less money, consumers are going to be able to purchase more of that for less as well. So then another thing that's really important in people's understanding of genetically modified crops is the role of mass media. Every single one of you could pull out your phone right now and Google genetically modified crops and get 10 different articles, the accuracy of which is questionable. You don't really know where you're getting your information. Anyone could post anything anywhere. So it's really important that you look at peer-reviewed types of articles. This basically comes from universities just like Virginia Tech, land-grant universities, and other ones that do studies on genetically modified crops. And it's all information that's been researched and supported by other intellectual people, not necessarily just the news, or like there's movements around the country of people who are against genetically modified crops, and they use a lot of strong propaganda to get emotion out of people. Some of that information is accurate, some of it's not. So it's really important to get a full understanding of genetically modified crops. So in conclusion, there's a lot of benefits of genetically modified crops, and they all pretty much lower production costs, which is going to be very important in feeding the growing world. By 2050, we're going to have to increase food production by about 70% to meet the standards that everyone is going to be having to survive. So it's really important to form an accurate and informed opinion on whether or not you approve genetically modified crops, to understand how you think they should be integrated into society, because our generation is going to be the one making the decisions on a lot of these things. So that's it. Thank you for listening.